Hello everyone, my name's Belinda and I'm here today to talk about kids product development. So everyone knows that the fastest way to boost profits is to launch new products. But before we get into the presentation, you can download the slides here if you want to, and I'll show you this again at the end so you can get the slides. So you're in the right place. Let's talk about the product development, the children's wear, the global children's wear marketplace. So in 2027, the marketplace should be worth 340 billion. That's an average compounding growth rate of 5.2%. And interestingly, it's going to be the infants and baby products that grow the most due to extra spending on baby product. So what does product development look like? Most brands, according to a 2024 survey by Browseware, spend about 17.6 weeks developing their products, which is over 4 months. One study into product development found that fashion brands spend on average they make 3 to 5 samples to get through to production. So the big question is, how do we develop kids' products effectively and safely without having to spend 17 weeks and do 5 whole samples? So here's what our product development process looks like. We've broken it down into about 9 different steps, and it's a simple 11 to 12 week process. So week 1 is for research. Of course, this is going to be the starting point for your product. You're creating something to sell, therefore your starting point is to look at, what do my customers want to buy? What is available for them to choose from? And how do I differentiate my product? Then we move into weeks 2 and 3, where we want to do 3 different things in tandem. We want to establish a rough price point for our product. We want to do this right at the beginning so we can start up a cost sheet, have a budget. We can subtract our margins and work out how much we can spend on production. Then we can work together on the design and materials in tandem. And these 3 stages go hand in hand, because the fabric and the materials, together with the design, are what's going to have the biggest impact on how the customer sees and understands your product. Then in weeks 4 to 6, we get into the technical details of the design. So here is where you'll flesh out all of the details, the technical specifications, the patterns, the artwork. I can't stress this enough. The better the quality of the specs that you create at this stage, the better your product is going to be, the better your sample making is going to be, and the easier your development process will be. So then we get to week 6 and 7, where we're going to make your first sample. This is going to be your first real-life and 3D version of your design idea. So if you're not very experienced at developing similar products, this sample might need a bit of work. It might not be perfect on the first try. Then once you have your sample in hand, you're going to want to test it. So this can include anything from user tests. This can include fittings, which is when you test out the fit on a professional fit model, to actual lab tests as well, which we'll come back to in a bit. So the idea is, in weeks 8 and 9, we want to prove all of our design assumptions are correct, and we want to verify that all of the design details translate well when put into a 3D article of clothing. So after we've done our tests, we need to summarize our findings. We create at TechPaxCo what we call a sample evaluation. So we note down all the test results, and we clearly indicate two things. Firstly, what, if anything, needs to be corrected to follow the original spec more closely? And secondly, what needs to be updated because we want to make an improvement to the design or the fit? It's super important to create a separate section for this in your specs so that you can communicate all of this really clearly to your factory. Then we come to the last stage, the solving of the problem. So here we're going to request a second sample based off of the updated specs. And the factory is going to be able to get this right because we've done everything, we've set up everything so clearly, and we've invested the initial extra 2 weeks in the beginning, spending extra time on our design concept and our materials to ensure that we don't get stuck in this 5-making sample process, this 17-week process, which just isn't necessary. And then we have a little buffer week at the end here, but you should be able to do this in just 11 to 12 weeks. So we've talked about an effective development process for children's wear product, but what about a safe process? How do we develop kids' product that's safe and appropriate for the age and the development of our kids? So this screenshot, here is from Reddit. I did a quick search on there to see what people were asking about developing, or not developing, what questions customers were asking about wearing kids' products. So a search for children's clothing finds thousands and thousands of posts of people struggling to understand the different sizes. Ordinary Lobster 406 says, "I'm having trouble grasping the nuances between similar-looking kid sizes. What's the reasoning here? 24 months versus 2T, 40 versus 4, 6 versus 6X, etc." So let's talk about that. Kid sizes are grouped into different categories, and the reason for this is to help brands design appropriately for the different age groups. Infants are going to need clothing that's a bit more like sleepwear. They nap a lot. It needs to be super easy to get on and off, work well with diapers, and work well for little bodies that crawl, not walk. A similar thing with toddler clothing. And then as we go up into kids' clothing, ages 4 to 6 usually, these designs are going to be slightly more appropriate for outdoor play, a bit more durable. And then again, as we go up into the older kids and the teens age groups, these styles are going to be a little bit more adult, following fashion trends a little bit more. And you're definitely not going to be using any of the baby styling here. So not all retailers still use these different 5 size categories. These days, brands often just break down their sizing into 3 groups. So typically you'd have baby, which is newborn up to 36 months. Then you'd have the younger children's category, or sometimes they'll refer to the little kids stuff as toddler, the toddler range. So that's from ages 2 or 3 up to 6 or 7. And sometimes they'll call that 2T to 5T instead if it's a toddler range. And then typically there's an older kids or preteens range, which starts at about 7 or 8, all the way up to 12, even up to 14 or 16 sometimes. So let's get into the details of exactly how to do kid sizing and what that looks like. Kid sizing is notoriously difficult to do. If you work for a big corporate brand, the design and product team for the children's wear is a completely separate department to the men's and women's designs. And if you're a small brand hiring consultants or freelancers or vetting suppliers, make sure that whoever you work with is an expert in kids sizing and has a specialist knowledge of children's products. So, as I'm sure you can tell from looking at children around you and at home, the proportions of a kid aren't obviously the same as an adult. They're much shorter and stockier. And while adult sizing caters to just one average height, so typically an extra small all the way up to an extra large in men's clothing is going to cater in the US to about an average height of 5'9". Same with women's sizes, starting at extra small, going all the way up to extra large. Women's sizes are typically going to cater in the US to an average height of 5'5". So kid sizes are obviously going to be completely opposite to that. As you grow up in age, you're going to be getting taller and taller, so you need to grade up the height of your children's clothing appropriately. And here's an image from a science paper on anatomy. You can see the figure on the left, the baby is scaled up, whereas the figure on the right, the woman, is scaled down proportionately. And you can see that the baby's body is about 25% head, 30% legs, whereas the woman, the adult woman on the right, she's got completely different proportions. She's more like 50% legs, and the head's only about 10% of their entire body. Similar thing with boys and men's. And interestingly, when you're an infant, your head is already almost about 90% of a full-grown adult-size head. And another note on region-specific sizing. Typically in the US and the EU, for children's clothing, you would use the age of the child to designate the style. So the sizes would be, age 2, age 3, age 4, etc. But in the EU, you should know that the children's sizes are actually designated by centimeters, and the centimeters refer to the height of the child. So back to our age groups here. Another useful thing to know is that within these 3 different age categories, it's only the older kids and the preteen category from age 7 and upwards where you would ideally like to have 2 different ranges, one for boys and one for girls. And that's because at around age 7 or so, kids start to develop different shaped bodies. Boys and girls, their bodies start to look a bit different. Whereas obviously in the infants and for the little kids as well, under the age of 6 or so, it's very easy to have gender-neutral clothing and just have one set of sizes and designs for both boys and girls, as typically their bodies are going to be the same on average, whichever gender they are. So let's talk about a few of the regulations you're going to need to know for children's product. I'll save this fun section for the end. So in the US, we have the Consumer Product Safety Commission. In the EU, we have the European Committee for Standardization. And in the UK, there's the British Standards Institute. So I'll give you an overview of each of the 4 sort of groups of regulations that you need to adhere to, but I definitely recommend that you check out what the standards are in the local market that you sell in and make sure that you adhere to those. So the first type of regulations you'll need to know about are for mechanical safety. So for this, in the US, we have the Consumer Product Safety Act, and in the EU, we have the Safety of Children's Clothing Mechanical Hazards. And that's applicable in both the EU and the UK. And you should know that when I refer to the EU, I'm also including the UK in that, because even post-Brexit, the UK still follows the same standards as in the EU. So these requirements are simply to protect kids from getting physically caught up somehow in the garment or in any items that are attached to the garment. So you're not allowed to attach or use anything that might cause a risk of any of the following things: restriction of blood pressure, choking or swallowing or strangulation, nothing that could cause tripping or falling or suffocation, no sharp edges or sharp points, and no small parts. The US and the EU regulations are ever so slightly different, but the intent is basically the same. You want to avoid anything hanging off the garment that could, pose a risk to a child. So in both the US and the EU, there is another group of regulations to be aware of, which all relate to cords and draw cords specifically. So in the EU, no toggles, knots, and embellishments or other attachments are allowed on loose drawstring ends. And then just in the EU, the cord ends must be secured and decorative cords can't be made from elastic. And no toggles are allowed to be used on anything with a free end. They've got to be fixed to the garment as well as to the drawstring. Then there's some additional regulations on the length and on the function of cords as well. So in the EU, up to age 7, you're not allowed any functional draw cords. And then no decorative cords either up to the age of 7 are allowed on the hood and sort of upper chest area or around the neck or the throat. For older kids' product, you can use draw cords, but they must be securely attached to the garment. In the US, it's very similar. No drawstrings are allowed in the hood and neck area, and that's from 2 all the way up to 12 or age 16 if you're in Wisconsin. And again, the waistband drawstrings must be secured at the midpoint so that they can't be pulled all the way out. So here are 2 photos of different trousers with an elasticated waistband. The image on the left shows a pair of trousers for younger kids. So you can see that the draw cord here, it's just a very short piece of cord. It's tied in a knot and it's attached to the front of the trousers. This is not a functional draw cord. It's just decorative and it can't actually be pulled to make the trouser tighter. Then on the right, we've got a pair of jeans for older kids. So you can see on this one, the waistband is functional. You can pull the cord to draw the waistband tight. But as you can see from the red arrow, you've got to add a stitch there to make sure that the draw cord is securely fastened to the back of the waistband. And for both the US and the EU, there are some maximum length restrictions depending on the different age of the child for things like zip pulls, tab adjusters, draw cords on hoods, draw cords on waistbands, loops, and belts and sashes. Now we get to the chemical regulations. So again, in the US, you've got to look at the Consumer Product Safety Act regulations. There's a whole section on toxicology. And in the EU, you need to take a look at the REACH regulations. And REACH stands for, I'm not going to tell you what REACH stands for because I've misplaced that slide, but it's to do with chemical regulations. So these are a list of the restricted substances. We've got things like azo dyes, phthalates, PFOAs. All of these are restricted, and you must do testing to ensure that you're compliant with these standards and that you don't go over the amounts allowed. Similar restrictions in the US, but not quite so many chemicals. In the US, you're mainly meant to avoid lead content in clothing and on prints. And in the US, you must use a laboratory that is third-party accredited by the CPSC. Then the last type of regulation that you need to be aware of is for the flammability of nightwear. So again, take a look at the Consumer Product Safety Act regulations in the US, and then in the EU, there are two different standards to look at. There are the nightwear flammability regulations and the specific children's nightwear regulations, which will only apply to certain products. So these in the EU cover kids' nightwear all the way from 3 months to 13 years, and they include night dresses, pajamas, dressing gowns, sleeping bags, anything worn for sleeping. And they give you maximum measurements allowed for chest and lengths and sleeves, because too much excess fabric around a garment is going to be a fire risk or more of a fire risk. And you must test the entire garment when you do flammability testing, not just the fabric. You've got to test the whole garment with the threads and the trims and the decorations. Then we have some flammability labeling requirements. So you've got to add a label with the words "keep away from fire." The labels must be permanent and secure, not obscured by anything else. And if you've got a set with 2 pieces, you must include the label at least in the top or the jacket. So typically that would look something like this. You've got the red text with "keep away from fire." And then again, in the US, very similar regulation, ever so slightly different. It applies to sizes 9 months to 14 years. And again, it covers night dresses, pajamas, robes, sleeping bags. But in the US, you also must do this for anything worn for sleep-related activities. So they in particular call out bedtime prep, story time, and lounging as well. But they do make an exception for underwear and diapers and baby clothes for babies under 9 months. There's also an exemption for tight-fitting sleepwear. So if you follow the measurements and make your sleepwear tight enough, the pajamas could be exempt from the children's flammability requirements and only need to adhere to the less stringent adult flammability requirements. And the tight sleepwear would look something like this. It's pretty skin tight. And in the US, again, there are flammability labeling requirements, ever so slightly different. You've got to have both a label on the back neck of the garment, and you also need to add a safety hang tag to the garment as well. So you've got to use the correct text, wear snug fitting, not flame resistant, and then you've got to use the correct text on the hang tag as well. So those would look something like this. You've got the text at the back neck on the label underneath the size designation, and it's got to be in a box, a certain font size. It's very specific. And then again, you've got this yellow safety hang tag that you've got to add as well. So that concludes this presentation. Product development for kids' products can be hard, but here's how you can win the game. Stick to an effective development process. These are the 9 steps. You've got your research, your costing, your design concept, the materials, specs, prototype, test, evaluate, and solve. So that's your 12-week process. And then we've got your 6 steps for product development. Your age-appropriate design, using the correct sizing, and then your 4 different categories of regulations, your mechanical safety, the draw cord regulations, the chemical regulations, and the flammability for nightwear as well. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. Please feel free to scan the slide deck by using the QR code, or you can go to techpacks.co/kids. I'm Belinda. I've been working in the design and production of clothing for the last 15 years. I got my first job in the fashion industry working for a children's wear brand that used to be around in the UK called Debenhams. And about 8 or 9 years ago, I started my own product development and design agency helping small brands to develop their own products for their company. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm going to stick around after this talk and get in touch. I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much, Global Sources.
Thank you, Belinda, for your presentation on the babies and kids sessions and products as well. And now we will take time for a Q&A session. So if there are any questions from the audiences, please raise your hand and we will pass the microphone to you already. Okay.
Forgive me if you mentioned this already, but in your research, did you see any mention of metal detecting for broken needles, specifically for children's wear brands?
Yes, there are some regulations that require you test your product once it's been sewn and that you pass it through metal detectors to make sure that there are no broken needles inside of the product.
Is that global or is it region specific?
I think it's applicable in the US, and off the top of my head, I can't remember if it's the same in the EU or not, but it's always a good practice to have and one that I think most factories would do.